Welcome to the Oncology Voice Network Podcast, connecting the voices that move oncology drug development forward.
Welcome to Oncology Voice Network Podcast. I'm Dr. Kirk Shepard. This show brings the real-world voices of oncology drug development to life. Leaders, innovators, patients, and partners who are shaping the future of cancer care. Today, we're exploring one of the most fundamental drivers of success in oncology, bringing clarity, alignment, and purpose to the commercial function. In a field where science is rapidly evolving and the stakes for patients are extraordinarily high, progress depends on more than breakthrough data. It depends on teams communicating clearly, learning from one another, and moving in the same direction. Our guest today is someone who has been leading that charge for years. Daniel Switzer is the head of U.S. Oncology Business Division at Daiichi Sankyo. He is a seasoned leader who has overseen major launches, guided large-scale transformations, and worked across every corner of the commercial and medical organization. In today's conversation, we'll explore what it truly means to be the voice of commercial in oncology. Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Kirk.
Maybe as a first question, you were the commercial voice for our chapter in our book, Voices of Oncology. What drew you into oncology and specifically into commercial leadership?
I think I'm one of the lucky ones. Oncology kind of came to me by happenstance. I've been with Daiichi Sankyo for about 20 years. And when I joined the organization in 2005, it was very much what we would consider today a specialty medicines company, cardiovascular, metabolic disease. That was about the first 10, 15 years of my career. The company shifted focus because we had some really interesting innovation scientifically in oncology. And actually, somewhat serendipitously, as our specialty portfolio was mature and sunsetting, we started to see some really positive signals in our oncology pipeline. And so I had the opportunity to work with the organization, lead the organization through a transformation into oncology, which has been really the most fun and the most rewarding experience of my career to this point. The commercial element of it, that's what I've done my whole career. I love the strategy. I love commercialization, and the opportunity to take that into a field with stakes as high as oncology was just a really great experience.
Was there a formative moment that shaped how you think about the impact of this work?
There's a few. I'll give you one example. On a personal level, there was a woman that I met who had been diagnosed with HER2-positive metastatic breast cancer. And I met her personally, not professionally, and we got to know each other. I learned a lot about her experience and her journey. And actually, I then was able to introduce her to our organization as a patient advocate. And she was somebody who was exactly the profile for someone who would be a candidate for our flagship product. And that really brought to life the meaning of what we were doing. It was one person talking about her experience, her family, her young child, everything about her journey from diagnosis to treatment, to what her hopes and aspirations were, and what medicines like ours could do to provide more time for her. It was a pivotal moment for me because it kind of shaped how I started to think about this new therapeutic area that for me was a job, but was providing so much benefit to what has become thousands and thousands of patients just like this one. So I think, on a personal level, that was a really special connection. There's another moment that actually happened a few years later at the ASCO Congress, where we presented, Daiichi Sankyo's data was presented, and it received a standing ovation by 1,000 people in the room.
Nice.
And I still have it on my phone. I was videoing, and I still get chills when I watch it. But to see all of these people who have dedicated their lives to treating cancer patients see something that was such a breakthrough that inspire them to get up and applaud and to do that for minutes and minutes in an entirely different way was an incredible moment to see the progress that we've made, not just as a company, but as an industry and as a field. When you have these breakthrough moments and people say, wow, this is going to change things for patients, that was pretty cool also.
Yeah, those are wonderful experiences. I mean, you work hard every day on oncology products. You sometimes forget what you're doing. You become so immersed in it. And when you see patients like that one you just told us about, and then also when you see celebration about the data, I mean, this is incredibly valuable to you as well as your team. So thank you for telling us about that.
It's still a job, right? So we still have all the frustrations that come with having a job and the meetings. And it puts all of that aside, at least temporarily, because it gives you real meaning in what you're working on and what you're doing.
Let's talk about the book, Voices of Oncology. When you wrote your chapter, what did you want most readers to understand about the commercial function in oncology?
I think the commercial function defines the organization's external credibility because it is the closest that we get to healthcare providers and to patients in our business. So to me, there's a dual role when you get as close as we get to the customer, in our case, the healthcare provider. One is, of course, to communicate, to educate, and even to promote products, science. But the other is to learn. And I think that the commercialization function really is the learning engine of an organization. We have hundreds of people who are what we would call field-based. Their job is to go out and interact with healthcare providers, all types of healthcare providers. And when you stack those interactions up one at a time, you realize that the organization's got a wealth of information through all of these interactions and conversations. And so the commercialization function, again, it both is how you message and how you want to talk about your company, your products, your value offerings, but it is as much that as it is learning, getting insights, and feeding that back so you can form new strategies, you can alter your developmental plans. And I think a big part of our launch success does happen one interaction at a time. And that's largely on the shoulders of the commercial function.
And what do you think are the biggest misconceptions about what commercial actually does?
I'll start with what I just said. I think a lot of time people think of the commercial function as sales. You're going out and you're selling. So you're messaging, you're telling. It is every bit as much about asking and learning as it is about telling and messaging. So it's not just about the sales function. It's about a complete alignment of everybody who impacts our customers. It starts with strategic functions in our headquarters, but it is very much on the individuals on our teams who have those interactions with healthcare providers. And those are very different functions. They could include sales, of course, but market access. We work very closely with the medical affairs functions, but anybody who touches the customer plays such an enormous role. And that coordination is incredibly important. I think the other misconception is we just go out and we do our job and we sell, and each function has a role to play. The amount of effort that goes into the coordination of each of those functions is really what defines success. So there are many different commercial and field-based functions that play an incredibly important role, from our medical science liaisons, our sales representatives and managers, our field reimbursement leads, our account managers. And if there isn't exceptional communication across that group, things get mixed up, customers get confused, and ultimately patients may not get the best treatment. It's not just let's go as fast and as hard as we can. There's so much coordination behind the scenes to make sure that we are bringing the very best value to hospitals and oncology clinics as we possibly can. I think the last misconception is that there's a little bit of an underestimation of how how much ethical responsibility falls on the commercial function. I'm in meetings all the time, of course, with our research team, development, safety, and everybody has the same goal, which is we want to provide the best benefit for patients. Of course, we want the sustainability of the organization, and we want to bring our medicines out to the healthcare community. But there's sometimes a misconception that commercial is all about the revenue. And that's not the case at all. In fact, commercial is often the ones, like I said, closest to the customer, closest to the patient. So there's a great deal of ethical responsibility on our shoulders as well.
Well, I've loved the fact that you've already talked about the importance of collaboration, not only the teams within commercial, but also outside of commercial. You've mentioned quite a few partners. And that's one of the themes of our book, as you know, and OVN, getting people together, breaking down silos, et cetera. When teams don't collaborate, one of my favorite quotes is from you in the book. You get confusion, noise, and wasted time. In fact, we stuck that in the introduction out of your chapter. So, but why is this especially dangerous in oncology?
Let's start with just the stakes in oncology, right? I've worked in a lot of therapeutic areas, and one is not more important than another, but the stakes in oncology are among the highest stakes in any therapeutic area because you're often talking about life, death, or just more time. And so when there isn't collaboration and alignment, anything that can get in the way of the patient getting the best treatment, the most appropriate treatment for him or her at that moment is a big problem. That when you say dangerous, I really do think it's dangerous because because of the stakes that we're talking about. When you have teams that are not collaborating and causing confusion in misalignment, priorities that don't line up, or even agreement of how you want to talk about your medicine, the recipients of that information and that education, who are the ones making the treatment decisions, don't know what to do. They don't have the best information. So when we talk about a drug, and in any interaction, you're talking about the efficacy of the product, the benefit of the product, and the potential safety risks and adverse events, effects of the product. In any of those, you need to provide the full picture, and it has to be consistent. And if the treatment decision maker doesn't either get a clear understanding of it, or even worse, hears different things from different team members, trust can fall away very quickly, and a product that could potentially benefit somebody greatly may get left on the shelf. So I really do think that this idea of misalignment leading to confusion and being dangerous, I think that is 100%. I mean, I guess I'm agreeing with myself, Kirk. I think it's 100% right. You have to have very clear and tight communication and understanding about how you talk about your medicines, in particular, the benefits and the risks.
You know, we all agree that alignment is very important, especially for commercial. You've already mentioned they sit at the intersection of medical, R&D, access, a number of disciplines. But what do you see as the biggest gaps right now in how teams share insights and learn together?
I think often insights come into an organization in parallel streams that don't ever connect. There's a lot of different ways that a company can learn and can get insights. I've talked about a couple of them already. Every interaction with a sales rep, you're getting some information out of that interaction. Every interaction from a medical science liaison, you're getting that. We do market research through third parties. We do other types of programs. On the R&D side, our clinical team is talking to investigators constantly. We have CROs talking to investigators constantly. There are thousands and thousands of insights that are at our disposal. Some of them are noise, but the ideal way to gather those insights and to synthesize them is to have them come in to somewhere central where you can learn what the themes are, and you can see where do those insights align across the functions, and perhaps Where do we see that there's some tension and some conflict between some of the things that we're learning? The biggest gap I see in terms of the insights is that they never come together. The medical insights stay with the medical team. The clinical development insights stay with the clinical development team, and the commercial insights stay with the commercial team. It's not an easy thing to do. And it's partly, I think, because of the way companies like ours are set up. But in order to fill that gap, you have to have this central place where the insights can come in, and you've got a group of people that is cross-functional that can understand them, synthesize them, process them, and then turn them into something actionable, because that's what you're trying to do at the end of the day. You're trying to learn and turn it into something actionable. I'll give you an example of a launch that didn't go as well as it should, partly because of this. This was one that was, for a whole number of reasons, it was a very short timeline of pre-launch operation and planning. And so there were some shortcuts that needed to be made. But what happened was that the insights that were coming in, that were really reaching the team that was building the strategy, they were all coming from one part of the organization. And those insights were coming from oncologists who were friendly to our program. They had been a part of the program. They may have been investigators. They had been advisors to us, but we had a bias in what we were learning about our own drug and about the market and the landscape. And it gave us an overconfidence in the product that we had, because we weren't including insights from at least as many oncologists, hematologists who didn't think our product was as good as the others, and just didn't see the compelling benefit that we were hearing about. And so it took us into the launch, past the launch, to reconcile, hey, there's a disconnect here. We thought we have this great drug, and we might, but there's a lot of people who don't see it that way. And when the insights come together earlier on, you can reconcile that early. You don't want to have to reconcile that 3-6 months into the launch. And so that's one of the learnings that I've had, is you really want to make sure you've got a diverse set of insights and sources, but more importantly, that they're all meeting at some point and they're informing the strategy together.
So that's very important. And when you talk about launch, where do launches typically succeed and where do they stumble? Can you see the pluses and minuses that occur within a launch?
Everybody involved in the launch, as early as possible, has to be clear on what certainly the purpose of your product, the purpose of your launch, and how you see the drug, how you see the medicine. That starts with understanding the customer needs, concerns, landscape, competition, and having a roadmap that everyone has agreed to on, here's where we're trying to go. And that destination may be a target product profile. It may be certain KPIs that you're achieving, even in terms of market share and sales and attitudes about and opinions about your drug. But everyone has to understand where the drug's benefit is and potentially where the risks are, because that informs things like the evidence generation plan. It informs how you message, how you talk about the drug. And the launches that have been the most successful are the ones where there's no daylight between the different functions on the understanding of how this product benefits patients, who's the ideal patient, and certainly who are patients that are not fitting the profile of eligibility for the product. So if everyone's really tight in that communication and confident in benefit risk profile and how we talk about it, it's a recipe for a very successful launch. On the flip side, and it's funny, sometimes you can be a victim of having such great data that you have so many endpoints to talk about that it's hard to choose them. So if you have really good overall survival, progression-free survival, secondary endpoints, you have a lot of different things to choose from how to talk about your product. The role of the marketing team, in my opinion, is to get the group focused on those 2 or 3 most compelling and use the others as perhaps secondary messages. But so that, everyone is talking about the same features, benefits, and risks about the drug so that it's very clear to the customers where to use it. I think that's the number one thing, is for them to be able to understand very easily, quickly, clearly, this is a patient that I'm going to choose this drug for. And when you do that right, and again, and you stack those interactions on top of each other, it can lead to a very, very successful launch.
And maybe just some of the mechanics you talked about, important to get everybody together, to get agreement. How does that happen? When does that start for you and your organization, and who's involved in that, and who are the leaders of that?
There's different phases of time. I mean, our group gets involved probably about 2 years before you expect to launch. We have even other global commercial functions that may get involved even earlier as you're designing trials. And, the venues for those, it sounds simple, they are meetings. They are getting people in a room or virtually together to talk about what your plans are. And they have to happen early enough where you can influence what you're going to be able to say about your drug. In particular, outside of the US, it's incredibly important because your reimbursement is going to be based on your overall profile. And if you choose the wrong comparator arm, you may end up with a positive study that no one's going to reimburse because they don't see the value of it. You congratulations, you beat a control arm that isn't the standard of care here. So we've got to feed all of that into the development team as early as possible to design those studies. And then as the data comes out and you start working on labeling, for instance, which is a great example of all of the teams coming together. I mean, the label from the commercial standpoint, it's all you got. I mean, so the label is incredibly important. It is literally what you can talk about or what you cannot talk about, and how you talk about your drug. So the labeling team is a cross-functional team that includes just about everybody in the company on some level to put together what you are proposing to the FDA, to receive feedback from the FDA, but ultimately to sign off on, this is our Bible for this product. And I think that's probably one of the best examples of how cross-functional collaboration can come together in an organization to align on, here's what we want to be able to say. And it's where you have people that have, I wouldn't say conflicting agendas or conflicting opinions, but different priorities. And that's where where there's any tension, it'll bubble up because you only get one label.
And how does all this early work then affect patient access later? So in other words, you have your label, you have your data, now you've got to go out and really get reimbursement for the product and access to the patients.
I mean, the access is often determined based on the benefit of this drug, and the benefit is only designed by the data that you have. So like I said, in terms of if you have the right comparator arm, if you captured the right endpoints, if the data is sound, all of those things will go into if it is a reimbursable drug. What's really tricky is that not only are the regulatory authorities around the world different and looking at different criteria, but even more so, the reimbursement authorities are also unique. And so that the information about what the reimbursement authorities will be looking for has to be fed into the program very, very early on. And then later in the process, when you identify what gaps you have, then you have to do other real world evidence analyses, HEOR analyses to support that package. But the success from a market access standpoint, it is both very early in the process to make sure that you're generating the right data that will be compelling. It is also very late in the process when you start to think about how you price your drug. That's become, of course, a very hot topic with the current administration in the U.S. and pricing policies, and how you engage payers, certainly locally here in the U.S., but around the world. But it's going back to the misconceptions. I think there's a misconception that the commercialization function's kind of the last mile. That's doing it wrong. If you do it right, the commercialization function is involved just about end to end, because it will be too late if you get something wrong and you're trying to get your drug reimbursed after pivotal studies.
You brought up a point that I think is really important too, just to talk about it for a minute, is the data gap analysis. In other words, you have everything neatly tied up. You go out with your data, with your messages, and suddenly you feel like the feedback you've gotten from your healthcare physicians, or maybe even access the reimbursers, saying, you don't have proof for this. How does that happen in your company when you have data gap analysis? Is that something you're involved with, multiple people? Is it part of the launch committee?
It starts with what we've already talked about, which is those are insights that have to come in from somewhere. And if they're coming into different parts of the organization, they may not get elevated to an urgent level until someone recognizes that we're hearing a lot of this. But if one person's hearing it over here and another person's hearing it over here and we're not talking about it, it may not get elevated to that level. So that the first thing is, again, it's just making sure that the insights that are coming in enable you to identify what those gaps are. And then, then what we would do is we would literally start to talk about, this is a gap that we have. We think it's an important gap. It is one that is either a barrier to utilization or creating a lot of uncertainty and unknown about how and when to use the drug. And we have to do something about it. And at that point, there's a few questions. One is, how do you generate the data to answer this question? Who's best suited to do that? What would the timelines be? Sometimes you have a question you'd love to answer tomorrow, but the study's going to take 5 years. And so the cross-functional nature of oncology, I think, plays out really well there, which is you've got people that are bringing in the insights. You've got a group that understands how to potentially generate the data to answer that question. You've got to get into the details of how you want to do that, when you want to do that, who's going to do that. And there are different functions within the organization that can generate data. Obviously, your R&D team does the bulk of it, but a medical affairs team, even a market access team, can sometimes generate the data that you need to answer these questions. It kind of depends who's asking and what is the question that you're trying to answer. That's a great example, Kirk, of something that cannot be done in a silo, like the labeling example. It's one of the reasons I think that the idea for your book is so brilliant, because it is the crux of what success looks like in oncology, having teams come together with an understanding that there's not one person or one group that has all of the knowledge and information or capacity to be able to do it alone.
Yeah, it wasn't a hard message to get people to say. I mean, went to every one of the voices, the disciplines, they all said the same thing. We got to be together as a team. We got to think of better ways to communicate, bring ourselves together. And they all echoed early. We're not brought in early enough. Almost every discipline said that. Of course, for R&D, which is brought in very early because we discovered the drug. But, and so when in the beginning, we first formed the book, we were going to have the table of contents in the order of which they are brought in. We couldn't do that because everybody's brought in about this, or should be brought in about the same time early. So essentially the table of contents is alphabetical order, because we couldn't really say this is first, this is second, this is third, this is fourth. So, but to now maybe jump from the book, the discussion of what you've done at your company, which has been brilliant. How can OVN help as far as the Oncology Voice Network, as far as supporting industry people, academia, those even outside of pharma, academic researchers? How can that help us to come together more and break silos?
First of all, it's raising awareness. And I think that in itself is really important. So the first step is, let's just get everyone to read it. I'm sure you'd be good with that. We need to learn from each other. I mean, every company has its own culture, ways of working, process. And I'm sure most of them have great processes and great ways of working, and also areas where they can do better, mine included, right? So if we can turn OVN into a physical network where we can learn from each other, I think there's a lot of benefit that ultimately will fall to patients, right? So we can all get together and we can share how different companies do things without revealing anything confidential, to talk about ultimately this is what's best for providers and for patients. And so tell me how you solve this problem in your company, and I'll tell you how I do it in mine. And let's figure out where the gaps are, and let's just raise the capabilities of the entire industry together uniformly. And I think that's what this book and the network can do. And I'd love to be a part of that. And I'd love to see that happen.
And you are a part of it. Thank you, Dan. I really appreciate the chapter you wrote and also the support you've given then to the transition from the book into a network OVN, which I might say, which I was thrilled about with all of the authors. First of all, all the authors were thrilled to be a part of the book. They said, yes, why hasn't this been written before? And then when we had the book written, and it was just launched, as you know, about 10 weeks ago, people are saying, well, what's next? We've got to make this come alive. So again, Dan, I appreciate you helping to make this come alive, and I look forward to speaking to you again.
And I really appreciate it. It's been a great opportunity, a really great experience working with you and being a part of it. So count me in for whatever comes next.
Thanks, Dan. That's it for this episode. I'm Dr. Kirk Shepard. Thank you for listening and for being a part of the conversation that's moving oncology forward.